They were there from the beginning, lurking in the shadows. Whispers of their existence echoed through time. Ancient civilizations knew their name: Sumerians, Aztecs. Each culture spun tales of horror. These were not creatures of whimsy and light. They were harbingers of a primordial darkness, a darkness that predated mankind. Their true forms remained shrouded in mystery. A terrifying glimpse was all that was ever offered. Small, almost childlike in stature, they moved with a disconcerting swiftness. Their skin, a sickly gray, seemed to absorb light itself. Legends spoke of their eyes, black as the void, windows to an ancient, unspeakable evil. Few ever saw them and lived to tell the tale. They were not creatures of folklore. They were real. A terrifying truth that haunted the edges of civilization, and now they had found their way to Houston, a modern metropolis, oblivious to the ancient evil lurking in its midst. The city would soon learn its lesson, a lesson written in blood. They were called gnomes, but the name belied their true nature. There was nothing charming about these creatures. Their features were grotesque, twisted mockeries of life. Their skin was rough and pitted, the color of a gathering storm. Their teeth were jagged shards, stained a macabre red. A single pointed tongue darted in and out of their mouths, tasting the air, savoring the fear that clung to it. Their eyes remained hidden, concealed beneath the shadow of wide-brimmed hats. Ancient, tattered things, black as pitch. The hats were never removed. Some whispered that to see their eyes was to invite madness. Others claimed it was to seal your fate. Their hands were deceptively frail. Long, bony fingers ended in wickedly sharp claws. The gnomes wielded crude blades, rusty and serrated, but their edges were razor-sharp. They moved with unsettling grace, gliding through the shadows, silent and deadly. They were predators, and they had developed a taste for human suffering. Houston, a sprawling testament to concrete and ambition, a city pulsing with life, unaware of the darkness that had descended upon it. The gnomes moved through the city unseen, like phantoms, haunting the back alleys and forgotten corners. They were drawn to the city's underbelly, places where fear and despair festered. They sought out the vulnerable, the lost and the lonely. Their victims were chosen at random, no pattern, no preference, just an insatiable hunger for pain. They struck swiftly, without mercy, leaving behind a trail of carnage that baffled the authorities. The police were clueless. The murders were brutal, savage. The victims were found dismembered, their bodies bearing strange, ritualistic markings. Whispers of the gnomes began to circulate, dismissed as urban legends, crazy ramblings of the desperate and the delusional. But Detective Isabella Santos knew better. She had seen the darkness firsthand, and it was about to consume her. The humid Houston air hung heavy, thick with the scent of exhaust fumes and cheap cologne. Old Man Miguel pushed his elote cart down the street. His shadow stretched long and thin in the orange glow of the streetlights. He was a familiar sight in the neighborhood, a comforting presence in the urban jungle. He had seen it all, or so he thought. The night was alive with the usual symphony of city sounds. Car horns blared, music thumped from passing cars. A couple argued in the distance, but something was off. A subtle shift in the air, a prickling sensation on the back of Miguel's neck. He paused, listening, straining to identify the source of his unease. There, at the edge of his hearing, a faint sound, a low guttural growl. He dismissed it, probably just a stray dog. He continued on his way, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Then came the screams, blood-curdling cries that ripped through the night, tearing at the fabric of normalcy. He knew that sound, the sound of a soul in torment. He had heard it before, years ago, in his small village in Mexico. The elders called them duendes, evil spirits that preyed on the weak and the unwary. He quickened his pace. His heart hammered against his ribs. He told himself it was nothing, but deep down he knew the darkness had found him. Miguel peered down a narrow alleyway. His cart squeaked to a halt. The stench of death hit him first. A wave of nausea washed over him. He gagged, trying to swallow it down. His eyes, accustomed to the darkness, slowly made out the scene before him. A group of figures huddled over something on the ground. Their movements were jerky, frenetic. He couldn't make out their faces, but he could see their hands, covered in blood. One of the figures detached itself from the group. It moved with an unnatural agility, scuttling like a spider. Miguel's breath caught in his throat. He saw it then. The creature's skin, a sickly gray, almost luminous in the darkness. He had seen that skin before, in his nightmares. He watched in horrified fascination as the creature darted towards a shadowy figure slumped against the wall. The figure tried to rise, to run, but it was too late. The creature lunged, its movements a blur. There was a sickening crunch, a scream cut short. The figure crumpled back to the ground. The other figures closed in. Miguel could hear the sound of tearing flesh, of bones snapping. He wanted to look away, to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in terror. The creatures fed with a primal hunger, ripping and tearing at the body with their bare hands. Their laughter echoed through the alleyway, a chorus of madness and despair. Miguel's stomach churned. He could feel bile rising in his throat. He had seen enough. He had to get out of there. He turned to leave. His foot caught on the edge of the cart. The metal wheels screeched against the pavement. The sound cut through the night like a siren. The creatures froze, their heads snapping up in unison. Their eyes, hidden beneath their wide-brimmed hats, seemed to pierce through the darkness, searching, hunting. Miguel's blood ran cold. He had been seen. He scrambled back, his hand closing around the crucifix he always wore around his neck. A gift from his grandmother, a symbol of hope in a world of darkness. Two of the creatures darted towards him, their movements swift and silent, like shadows given life. Their claws glinted in the moonlight. Miguel's mind raced. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run. He closed his eyes. His fingers tightened around the crucifix. He whispered a silent prayer, a plea for salvation, a desperate bargain with a god he had not spoken to in years. The first creature lunged, its claws aimed at Miguel's throat. He thrust the crucifix forward, a desperate, last-ditch effort. The creature recoiled as if burned. A high-pitched wail escaped its throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. The second creature hesitated. Its eyes, still hidden beneath its hat, darted back and forth. Confusion warred with its bloodlust. It snarled, baring its teeth, but it kept its distance. Miguel stumbled back, his heart hammered against his ribs. He had been spared, for now. Adrenaline surged through his veins. He turned and ran. He didn't dare look back. The sound of his own ragged breathing filled his ears. He could hear the creatures behind him, their claws scraping against the pavement. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air. He had to get to safety. He had to warn someone. He burst onto the street, his chest heaving. He glanced over his shoulder. The creatures were gone, vanished back into the shadows, but he knew they were out there, watching, waiting. He continued walking, each step filled with a growing sense of dread. He had escaped their clutches once, but he knew they would be back. He felt a sharp pain in his ankle, a searing, white-hot pain that sent him crashing to the ground. He looked down. His blood ran cold. His ankle was gone, severed clean through. He could see the bone gleaming white in the moonlight. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creatures emerged from the shadows, their eyes burning with a cold, malevolent fire. They circled him, their laughter echoing in his ears. He closed his eyes, accepting his fate. He had cheated death once, but even miracles had their limits. He felt a searing pain in his shoulders, then his hips, each movement accompanied by a sickening crunch. He was being dismantled, piece by piece. He heard a voice, speaking in a language he didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Mockery, triumph. He felt something cold and hard pressed against his cheek. He opened his eyes. He was face to face with one of the creatures. Its breath smelled of decay and rot. Its eyes bored into his. He could feel his life force draining away. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the creature's grotesque grin. He was right. Even miracles had their limits. Detective Isabella Santos stared at the photograph clutched in her hand. The edges were worn soft with time. The colors faded, but the smiles remained, frozen in time. Her father, Miguel, his arm slung proudly around a younger, less weary Isabella. His eyes crinkled in the corners, his smile infectious. She could almost hear his laughter, a deep booming sound that used to chase away the shadows. He had been more than just her father. He was her confidant, her protector, her anchor in a world that seemed determined to sweep her away. He had taught her the importance of family, of loyalty, of facing your fears with your chin held high. He had instilled in her a deep sense of justice, a burning desire to protect the innocent. It was that desire that had led her to become a detective, to walk the thin blue line between order and chaos. She traced the outline of his face with her thumb. Her heart ached with a familiar grief, a grief that had dulled with time, but never truly faded. He had been taken from her too soon, ripped away by an act of senseless violence that had left her reeling, lost, adrift in a sea of unanswered questions. The official investigation had been a farce, a hastily cobbled-together excuse for justice. They had labeled it a random act of gang violence, case closed. But Isabella knew better. She had seen the look in her father's eyes in those final moments, the sheer terror that had gripped his soul. This had not been the work of petty thugs. There had been something else at play that night, something ancient, something evil. She had made a promise that night, standing over his grave, her hand resting on the cold, unforgiving stone. She would find out what happened. She would bring his killers to justice, no matter the cost. Detective Miller's voice crackled through the receiver. The phone buzzed on her desk, jarring her from her thoughts.
Santos, you got a minute?
His tone was clipped, professional, but she could hear the underlying tension.
Be right there.
His eyes were bloodshot, his hair a mess. He had been up all night, she could tell. She found Miller hunched over a computer screen, his face illuminated by the cold blue light. The air crackled with a nervous energy. The bullpen was abuzz with activity. Phones rang, officers barked orders.
What do we have?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Miller swiveled in his chair, his face grim.
You're not going to believe this.
The marking sent a chill down her spine. She had seen them before, in her nightmares, in the darkest corners of her memory, their flesh covered in strange ritualistic markings. The victims were unrecognizable, their bodies twisted and broken. He gestured to the screen. A series of gruesome photographs filled the monitor.
What the hell happened here?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Miller shook his head.
No witnesses, no suspects, just this. We don't know. Found them like this in an alley downtown.
He gestured to the screen again, his voice cracking.
It's like something out of a horror movie. Have you identified the victims?
She asked, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the carnage. Miller nodded.
It's like they just appeared. John Doe and Jane Doe. No IDs, no missing persons reports that match their descriptions.
He rubbed his eyes wearily.
Look, I know this is a long shot, but these markings...
He hesitated.
They remind me of something. Something your father used to talk about.
Isabella's blood ran cold. Her father's stories, the ones he used to tell her when she was a child, stories of ancient creatures, of dark magic, of things that went bump in the night. She had dismissed them as fairy tales back then, harmless bedtime stories meant to scare away the shadows. But now she wasn't so sure.
What are you saying, Miller?
Her voice barely a whisper. Miller took a deep breath.
I know it sounds crazy, but what if those stories were true? What if there's something else out there? Something we don't understand?
He looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to understand.
I know you think I'm losing it, but I've seen things, Santos, things I can't explain.
Isabella stared at the photographs, at the twisted, broken bodies, at the strange, ritualistic markings. Her mind rebelled against the thought. It was too much, too impossible. And yet, a part of her, a deep primal part of her that she had kept buried for years, whispered that it might be true, that the darkness her father had warned her about was real. She took a deep breath. The scent of stale coffee and fear hung heavy in the air, but beneath it all, faint, almost imperceptible, was another scent, a sickly sweet smell, like rotting fruit and decay, the smell of death. But not just any death. This was different, older, more primal. It was the smell of something ancient, something evil. And it was calling to her, beckoning her towards a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The scent lingered in Isabella's nostrils, a fetid reminder of the horrors she had witnessed. The smell of the gnomes, her father's stories, once dismissed as folklore, now echoed in her mind with chilling clarity. She had to know more, had to separate truth from legend. Her investigation started in the heart of the city, the shadowed alleys and forgotten corners where the murders occurred. The crime scenes were eerily similar, isolated, devoid of witnesses, the victims seemingly chosen at random. The only commonality, the brutality of the killings and the strange markings carved into their flesh. Markings that spoke of an ancient ritual, a language she couldn't decipher. Yet, she interviewed the few witnesses willing to come forward, their stories fragmented, contradictory, whispers of shadowy figures, of inhuman speed and strength, of eyes that burned with an unholy fire. Each account added another layer of fear, another brushstroke to the grotesque portrait of the killers. Days bled into nights. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford, haunted by the victims, by the gruesome spectacle of their deaths, by the fear that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. She pushed herself further, driven by a need for answers, for justice, for vengeance. The gnomes would pay for her father, for the innocent lives they had stolen. She swore it. Isabella delved into the city's underbelly, a labyrinth of forgotten tunnels and abandoned buildings, places where the city's darkness festered, where the gnomes seemed to move with impunity. She sought out historians, folklorists, anyone who might have knowledge of the creatures, their history, their weaknesses, their motives. She pored over ancient texts, dusty scrolls filled with cryptic symbols and chilling tales, stories whispered through generations, passed down from those who had encountered the creatures and lived to tell the tale. The gnomes were real, not figments of imagination or drunken ramblings. They were ancient, predating human civilization, whispered to have walked the earth when it was young. Their origins remain shrouded in mystery. Some texts spoke of them as guardians of a forgotten realm, others as harbingers of chaos and destruction. All agreed on one thing: they were not to be trifled with. They were drawn to fear, to despair, to the darkness that lurked within the human soul. Each piece of information, each chilling tale, only deepened Isabella's resolve. The gnomes were more than just killers. They were a force of nature, ancient and malevolent. But even forces of nature had their weaknesses. She just had to find them. One clue proved particularly intriguing: the markings carved into the victims. They were not random acts of savagery. They were deliberate, purposeful. They formed a language Isabella was determined to decipher. She reached out to Professor Ramirez, a renowned linguist specializing in ancient languages, an expert in the forgotten tongues of lost civilizations. He examined the photographs, his brow furrowed, his eyes flickering between the images and the notes scattered across his desk.
"These symbols," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "They are unlike anything I have ever seen, ancient, primal. They seem to predate any known human language." He looked up at Isabella, his eyes filled with a mixture of fascination and fear. "I believe these are the markings of the duendes."
Isabella's heart skipped a beat. The duendes, her father's stories, the whispers of her childhood nightmares, they were real, and they were responsible for the horrors plaguing her city.
Can you translate them? She asked, her voice barely a whisper.
The professor hesitated. "I can try, but be warned, detective. Some things are better left buried. Some knowledge comes at a price." He picked up a magnifying glass, his gaze returning to the photographs, his fingers tracing the outlines of the symbol. The language of shadows is not easily understood, and it is even more dangerous to speak.
As Isabella delved deeper into her investigation, a sense of dread settled over Houston. The murders continued, each one more brutal than the last. The city, once a beacon of progress and prosperity, now cowered under a pall of fear. The whispers started, growing louder with each passing day. The duendes, the creatures of darkness, they walked among them, unseen, unstoppable. The media, hungry for a story, seized upon the rumors, spreading fear and paranoia like wildfire. The police department, overwhelmed and outmatched, offered little comfort. The city held its breath, trapped in a nightmare of its own making. Isabella felt the weight of the city's fear on her shoulders, the responsibility to stop the creatures before they claimed another victim, before the city tore itself apart from within. She knew time was running out. She could feel it in her bones, in the chill that ran down her spine every time the wind howled through the streets. The gnomes were out there, watching, waiting, and she was running out of time to stop them. The air grew heavy, suffocating. The scent of decay intensified, assaulting Isabella's senses. A sign. The gnomes were near. Professor Ramirez's words echoed in her mind. The translation. A location. A confrontation she couldn't avoid. Not anymore. This was personal. The abandoned church stood at the edge of the city, forgotten, desecrated. A sanctuary turned sepulchre. Its stained glass windows, once vibrant with color, were now dark, vacant eyes staring out at the encroaching night. She pushed open the creaking door, the sound like a death rattle in the stillness. Inside, shadows danced in the faint moonlight filtering through cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air hung thick with the smell of mildew and decay. And something else. Something ancient, malevolent, the scent of the gnomes. She took a step inside, her hand hovering over the service pistol at her hip. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. She could feel their eyes on her, watching her every move from the shadows. She knew they were here, waiting. She drew a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She wouldn't be their next victim. She wouldn't let fear control her. She had a promise to keep, justice to deliver, and she would face them head-on, armed with faith and fury. Professor Ramirez had warned her about the dangers of confronting the gnomes, about the darkness that lurked within their hearts, about the power they wielded. But he had also given her a weapon forged not of steel or gunpowder, but of faith. A weapon that resonated with an ancient power the gnomes seemed to fear. She clutched the crucifix in her hand, the cold metal a comfort against her palm, a symbol of hope in the face of despair, a beacon of light in the encroaching darkness. She had scoffed at its significance before, dismissed it as a relic of a bygone era. But now, she clung to it with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. She moved deeper into the church, her eyes scanning the shadows, her ears straining for any sound. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping with each step she took, a chill that seeped into her bones, threatening to extinguish the fire that burned within her. She stopped at the foot of the altar, the once sacred space now desecrated by cobwebs and dust. A single ray of moonlight pierced through a crack in the ceiling, illuminating a shattered stained glass window depicting the Virgin Mary. A fitting backdrop for the confrontation to come, a battle between good and evil, between light and darkness. And she was caught in the middle. A low growl echoed through the church, sending shivers down her spine. Then they emerged from the shadows. 3 figures, small and grotesque. Their skin, a sickly gray, seemed to absorb the surrounding light, making them appear even more menacing. Their eyes, hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, burned with an unholy fire. Their claws scraped against the stone floor, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. They moved with an unnerving swiftness, circling her like predators sizing up their prey. their movements jerky and erratic, defying the laws of physics. She raised the crucifix, her finger tracing the outline of the figure nailed to its surface.
Leave this place. Leave this world. You are not welcome here.
Her words hung in the air, a challenge to the darkness. The gnomes paused, their heads tilting to the side in unison as if considering her words. Then they attacked. They moved with a speed that belied their size, their claws flashing like lightning strikes. She dodged and weaved, her movements fueled by adrenaline and fear. The crucifix became her shield, deflecting their blows, the metal burning their flesh on contact. She fought back, her every strike aimed at driving them back, at keeping them at bay. The air crackled with energy, the smell of ozone filling her nostrils. The shadows danced around them, swirling and twisting, reflecting the chaos of the battle. She was outnumbered, outmatched. But she wouldn't give up. She couldn't. Her father's memory. The innocent lives lost. They fueled her rage, her determination. Isabella stumbled back, her breath ragged, her muscles screaming in protest. The fight had taken its toll. She was exhausted, wounded. But she had to keep going. One of the gnomes lay motionless on the cold stone floor, its body smoking, the stench of burnt flesh filling the air. The crucifix had worked. It was a weapon against their kind, a beacon of light against their darkness. But the remaining two were relentless. Their eyes, burning with hatred, never left her. They moved like phantoms, their forms blurring, making it almost impossible to track their movements. One lunged, claws extended, aiming for her throat. She parried just in time, the crucifix scraping against bone, eliciting a hiss of pain from the creature. She knew she couldn't keep this up for much longer. They were tiring her out, wearing her down. She needed a plan, a way to end this. But how do you fight creatures born of shadow and fear? Creatures that seem to exist outside the natural order? A desperate idea formed in her mind. A gamble. A dangerous one. But she was out of options. She had to trust her instincts. Trust in the power she wielded. Trust in the promise she had made. She closed her eyes, drawing strength from the memory of her father, from the faces of the victims, from the weight of the city's fear pressing down on her. She charged, not at the gnomes but past them, towards the altar, towards the shattered stained glass window depicting the Virgin Mary. The gnomes hesitated, momentarily caught off guard by her sudden change in tactics. It was the opening she needed. She reached the altar, spinning around, the crucifix held high, her body a shield between the creatures and the shattered image of the Virgin.
This city is under her protection. You will not have it. I offer myself in their place. Leave this world and never return.
The gnomes hissed, their forms flickering, their shadows writhing on the walls like living things. They seemed to shrink back, as if repelled by an invisible force field. The air crackled with energy, the scent of ozone growing stronger. The temperature plummeted, the cold seeping into her bones, threatening to extinguish the last vestiges of her warmth. And then, it hit. A blinding flash of light erupted from the crucifix, engulfing the church in a blinding white fire. She screamed, the force of it throwing her back against the altar, the air knocked from her lungs. She lay there, dazed, her vision swimming, the taste of copper filling her mouth. Silence, eerie, unsettling silence. She slowly pushed herself up, her body aching, her vision blurry. The light faded, the gnomes were gone, vanished without a trace. Only the lingering smell of burnt flesh and ozone remained, a testament to the battle that had just transpired. She had won, but at what cost? She looked down at her hand. The crucifix was gone, melted, fused to her palm, the metal seared into her flesh, a permanent reminder of the sacrifice she had made, a sacrifice she would carry with her for the rest of her days. The city was safe, her father avenged. But the victory felt hollow, a Pyrrhic victory. She had stared into the abyss, and in return it had taken a part of her soul, and she knew deep down that the darkness was never truly vanquished. It was merely biding its time, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The morning light painted the shattered windows of the abandoned church in hues of blood orange and ash gray. Detective Isabella Santos emerged from the wreckage, her steps slow and deliberate, her body a tapestry of new scars. The city breathed again, unaware of the battle waged and the sacrifice made in its name. Newspapers trumpeted the end of the killing spree, attributing it to a rival gang war, a convenient lie readily swallowed by a populace desperate for normalcy. Isabella, however, knew the truth. The gnomes were gone, banished back to the darkness from whence they came, but the memory of their presence lingered, a bitter aftertaste in the back of her throat. The city might forget, but she never would. The crucifix melded with her flesh throbbed faintly, a constant reminder of the price paid for peace. She returned to her life, to the routines of her job, but something had shifted within her. The world seemed sharper, the edges more defined. The laughter of children held a note of fragility, a stark reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. She became a silent guardian, her gaze forever drawn to the shadows, her hand instinctively reaching for the phantom weight of the crucifix. The city thrived, oblivious to the sacrifice made in its name, but Isabella carried the weight of knowledge, the burden of memory. The gnomes were gone, but the scars of the unseen ran deep, a chilling testament to the ancient evils that slumbered beneath the veneer of civilization, waiting for the opportune moment to awaken once more.